Research Forum. Thanks for being here today. We have an all-star panel today to tell you about cardiovascular outcomes for diabetes drugs. One housekeeping issue before we get started. Next week's Research Forum is canceled due to ACC, so for those of you going to Orlando, hope you have a wonderful and safe trip and great conference. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Granger, who apparently doesn't have a chair, so we'll be modeling good cardiovascular risk prevention practices by standing the whole time. I hope that's okay with you. Okay.
Try to have good posture. I will get some walking. I'll get some steps.
Research conference.
Or actually, you guys are going to share.
Okay, share. The mic, your show.
So great. I have a microphone. So great. So welcome, and we look forward to a panel discussion and engaging you all too in what I think is a really important topic. But before I get into that, maybe Matt, can you introduce yourselves and about your interest in this topic?
Sure, Matt Rowe, cardiologist here, and I've been helping to direct the think tank series for the last few years, and have a particular interest in clinical trials, especially now in diabetes and cardiovascular outcomes trials, which is a really growing area. So I was really pleased to be part of this. I think this is a fantastic think tank, probably the best one that I've been at ever.
Great, thanks.
It's also the best one I've ever been at. It's the only one I've ever been at. I'm Neha, and I'm a cardiologist, and I'm interested in cardiometabolic health, both clinically and from a research perspective.
And I'm Eric Peterson, and I'm interested in diabetes and cardiovascular trials and implementation.
There we go. Perfect.
I'm Jennifer Green. I'm an endocrinologist. I joined the DCI faculty in 2008 at the start of the TICOS trial, which is one of the CV diabetes outcomes trials that we'll be discussing today.
Great. So the topic is cardiovascular disease and diabetes and drug development for patients with diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And it's a really important topic. Probably most of you kind of have a sense of this, but Rob Califf gave a not surprisingly inspirational dinner lecture at our meeting, at this meeting in the end of January, this think tank. And he made the key points that, including telling anecdotes about the FDA experience, which he's not been able to do until recently because he had a one-year moratorium on talking about these things. But in addition to that, he highlighted the fact that for the first year since the flu epidemic in 1917, life expectancy decreased this year in the U.S. And two of the main contributors to that are the opioid epidemic, which is actually particularly important in North Carolina. I think New Hanover is like the #1 county in the United States for opioid-related deaths, and the diabetes epidemic, or cardiometabolic, the fact that now we are seeing the consequences of obesity and diabetes impacting cardiovascular health in a way that's manifesting a shorter life expectancy. So it's a big deal, and it's something that's incredibly important. The history for Duke in this particular topic goes back at least to 1997 when the first think tank, one of the first think tanks was actually,
95 or 97.
It was 97 with, and it was on this issue of cardiovascular outcomes in patients with diabetes and the effect of these drugs. And back then we knew very little. There were a couple of early trials that provided some information, but the main conclusion of that think tank was that we need more research in this area. And then there was another one in 2004, and another one in 2007. And the one in 2007 actually, that by this point, this was the time when Steve Nissen had done some work using some data that was not particularly high quality, but available through the FDA to highlight the fact that the drug rosiglitazone was associated with cardiovascular risk. And then this think tank ask the question, is it good enough when we develop drugs to look at glucose control, or should we really be getting beyond that and looking at cardiovascular outcomes? And I think that meeting did have some role in prompting the FDA to say there needs to be a new paradigm about these drugs, because there really is uncertainty about the impact of these drugs on cardiovascular outcome. And in fact, for patients with type 2 diabetes, the main adverse outcome that these patients have is cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, stroke are the most important outcomes. Therefore, these drugs, it's really important to understand the effect of these drugs on those outcomes. And that led to this guidance that's shown on this slide, this 2008 guidance. There was draft guidance earlier that year. And you guys can't see this, can you? But these are some of the, I think it's, yeah, maybe you should sit down. Yeah, go ahead and sit down for a minute.
I'll sit down until you're ready.
I'm going to take about 5 minutes to go through this, because this is, I do think it's important information. People in the back may not be able to read this either, so I'll read some of it. So it's a pretty short document. I think it's a total of 6 pages of text. And it really makes 4 or 5 key points that are the basis of the think tank. The think tank was really designed to ask the questions, since 2008, over a 10-year period, what have we learned based on the results of this guidance, and what should be done differently now? So those were really the questions that we brought together, the typical think tank interdisciplinary group, including something like 20 people from the FDA and people from NIH, from funding agencies, including commercial insurance and CMS, as well as academic and industry leaders. And so this was the guidance. The recommendation was to establish the safety of new anti-diabetic therapy and to treat type 2 diabetes. Sponsors should demonstrate that the therapy will not result in an unacceptable increase in cardiovascular risk. That's important. The intent here was not to prompt sponsors to show that there was benefit. It was to show that there was not unacceptable increase in cardiovascular risk, and to ensure that a new therapy does not increase cardiovascular risk to an unacceptable extent. The development program should include the following. And this is interesting. The first recommendation was, and this was partly based on the fact that this data that Steve Nissen reviewed included data on, for example, myocardial infarction with some uncertainty as to whether these were real myocardial infarctions. They weren't really very well defined or adjudicated. So the first recommendation was a good one that we liked from the perspective of the DCRI clinical events classification group, and that is that there be a formal clinical events classification strategy, and that the outcomes of interest needed to include cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, and stroke. That was what was required. And then they could include hospitalization for acute coronary syndrome, urgent revascularization, and possibly other endpoints. And we'll get back to that, because there's been some important experience here. They also acknowledged the fact that when there are a series of trials done, that a meta-analysis technique could be used to incorporate all the information on a new drug to establish whether or not there was a signal of harm, that the trials should include patients at higher risk of cardiovascular events to assure that both there were enough events occurring and that the results would be applicable to the population for whom we have the greatest concern, which is those at higher cardiovascular risk. And then there also was a specific comment that the trials needed to be long enough, with a minimum of 2 years of follow-up, to understand what the longer-term effect was of these drugs. This was a topic that we covered to some extent in the think tank. It's a challenge, right, because most clinical trials don't include the long-term follow-up that our patients get exposed to when treated for a lifetime of type 2 diabetes and are subjected, therefore, to potential risk, that a meta-analysis should be performed, including all the available data. And then the statistics were interesting and somewhat arbitrary at the time. That there were these two boundaries that were created, a boundary of 1.8 in order to get the drug approved provisionally, so that one would have to exclude with 95% confidence a greater than 1.8-fold increased risk of cardiovascular outcomes. And then once that was done, one would also need to exclude a 1.3-fold increased risk as a second step. And that could either be done right away in the initial development program before approval, or it could be done in a post-approval required cardiovascular outcome trial. And the way the guidance was written, it could even be done in one trial. So you could do one trial and have a data safety monitoring board that would decide after there were about 90 or 100 events, which is the number needed to exclude the 1.8-fold margin, and then keep that trial going until the 660 or so events that would typically be needed to assure that the 1.3-fold margin was excluded. So I'll just briefly mention this, and then we'll get the panel up. So what happened from? So that was 2008, and then what happened from over that 10-year period? We spent a fair amount of time going through this, but it was pretty interesting what happened. The first thing that happened is industry was pretty upset because they were going to have to spend. Jennifer told me like $400 million per trial. We can do it more cheaply, but most of these programs, it's something like, I think it's more typically been, and we heard about like canagliflozin program was like $1 billion, I think something like that.
That sounds fairly expensive. One of the trials
Well, it was
that we
like
ran
3
here
trials
was a
or
little
something.
under 250 million. So
Yeah.
it
But
really
anyway.
depends.
A lot of money went into these, and so industry was not happy. They were going to have to spend all this money before they could sell these drugs to lots of people who have type 2 diabetes. So the initial response, I think, and even some of the academic leaders, I think, were a little bit irritated that this barrier was in place. But then over time, people became, well, and especially once there were drugs shown to be actually beneficial, then people said, wow, this was a great thing. Now we actually have some drugs that are beneficial. So there were at least 15 large programs of new diabetes drugs performed, many billions of dollars spent, maybe, I don't know, maybe $10 billion, and spent, you could argue, for what's not a terribly exciting objective, and that's to prove that these new drugs, which are very expensive, are not worse than placebo. Doesn't sound like a very, exciting thing to be involved with, to prove something is not worse than placebo for really serious problems occurring. And then what happened is none of these trials showed increased cardiovascular risk. Every one of them has shown a less than a 1.8 margin for increased risk. So one could say, okay, 0 out of, I don't know how many have actually been reported out, 12 or 14 or something, in terms of the programs. But you said 10, you think 10? Yeah. So what does none out of 11 mean? Does that mean that this will never happen? No, it doesn't mean it will never happen, but it certainly suggests that most of these drugs, in spite of the initial concern, don't have cardiovascular risk. But some did show other risks, like heart failure and liver toxicity and other things, which one could argue were seen largely because the trials were large enough and because the adjudication committees were in place to kind of be looking at things, cardiovascular outcomes, in a fairly systematic way. And then these 4 drugs that Neha will go through a little bit, I think, showed cardiovascular risk reduction, statistically significant improvements in cardiovascular outcome. And 2 of those have been approved with labeling to acknowledge that they improve cardiovascular outcomes. But then finally, the final kicker is none of these are being used in practice. So huge amount of money went into showing these drugs were not harmful. Some of them were shown to be beneficial, and then those aren't being used in practice. And so we talk some about why. We finally have something to improve cardiovascular outcome for one of the largest causes of cardiovascular disease in the world, and they're not being used. Why is that, and how can that be addressed? So that's a little bit of background. Now I'll get the panel up. And actually, Neha, maybe you can take us through the next couple of slides.
Want to do the slides first?
Okay, maybe. Sorry, maybe one more. Sorry. You're getting a little exercise.
Okay, so I will just very quickly, just to kind of get everybody on the same page of what these drugs are. I'm just going to quickly outline the 4 trials that have been done that were positive, that showed benefit, and that everybody will talk about. So the first one was EMPA-REG outcome. This was published in 2015, and it was with the drug empagliflozin, which is an SGLT2 inhibitor. And I think of these, I'm sure Jennifer can give a much better explanation. I think of these drugs like a cardiologist thinks of them, and so very simply. And so SGLT2 inhibitors give you sweet pea. You pee out your glucose. And this was the only one of the positive trials that only looked at a secondary prevention population. Everybody had a history of cardiovascular disease, and they also obviously had type 2 diabetes. And what they found was over a mean of 3.1 years, there was a 14% risk reduction for MACE, 38% risk reduction for cardiovascular death, and nobody saw this coming. This was the first of these trials to come out that was positive, and nobody saw this coming. And the curve split very early, so the thought was that for this SGLT2 inhibitor, this might be kind of a hemodynamic effect. Maybe it led to some diuresis in these patients who had subclinical volume overload. And along those lines, there was a 35% risk reduction in heart failure hospitalization. Again, a huge risk reduction in heart failure. The downsides to this drug is that it can cause some pelvic infections because you're peeing out sweet pea. For LEADER, that was liraglutide, that came out in 2016. That looked at both a primary and a secondary prevention population, but the majority of the people had cardiovascular disease. That also showed, and this is, sorry, I should say this is a GLP-1 agonist. And so a GLP-1 agonist is an incretin hormone. And again, I think of this very simply, that's a hormone from the gut that does things to make your sugar better. And I'll keep it at that because it does a lot of different things. There was a 13% risk reduction for MACE, 22% reduction for cardiovascular death, though the MI and stroke and heart failure risk reductions were non-significant. There you can potentially get a lot of GI upset. That may be part of why it helps people lose weight, and some gallstones. Semaglutide came out the same year. That is another GLP-1 agonist, as opposed to liraglutide, which is a daily, I should say that's a shot. Empagliflozin is a pill that you take every day. Liraglutide is a shot that you take every day. Semaglutide was a once-weekly shot. That was also done in a primary and secondary prevention population, also showed a MACE risk reduction of 26% and a hefty stroke reduction of 39%. And this is in the same class, and you see a stroke reduction here and not in with liraglutide. So it's kind of interesting we're seeing some of these differences within a class. The issue there was retinopathy. And then the final one was CANVAS, which was canagliflozin, which included kind of 2 trials within it, one a general cardiovascular outcome trial and one a renal program, a renal outcome trial. Again, looked at people with both primary and secondary prevention, but here, starting to move more towards a primary prevention population. The majority of people had not had prior cardiovascular disease. Again, we see a 14% MACE risk reduction, 33% heart failure reduction. But here, as opposed to with empagliflozin, this is another SGLT2 inhibitor. People's toes come off. Just the toes, though, not from the knee. It's really toe and metatarsal amputation was 2-fold greater with canagliflozin than with placebo. So that's just a quick outline of the 4 positive trials. And this is just to outline, basically emphasize what Dr. Granger has said, which is the space has gotten really crowded in the last few years. This outlines the trials that have been done, that have preliminary results, and that are ongoing in green. And I think Dr. Granger's right that if you were to guess, probably somewhere around $10 billion have been spent on these programs. That doesn't include R&D and everything that went before it. And at least some of the data that we have at Duke, and we can get at this, but of patients at Duke who have diabetes and cardiovascular disease, 1.7% of them are on a GLP-1 agonist and 0.2% are on an SGLT2 inhibitor, at least as of the end of 2016. So it's basically nobody. And so this just gives you a sense of kind of some of that perspective.
Perfect, thanks, Neha. And just leave that up, and now let's get the panel back. Try one more time, yeah. And maybe, and if people have questions, please ask questions as we go through. John has a question, or no? You will soon. But let me ask, the final preamble is Jennifer. I would like for Jennifer just to comment, including for many of you in the room who've been involved in trials at the DCI, about what the DCI involvement has been with these trials.
Well, the DCI involvement has been fairly extensive for many of these trials. And as you may know, the TICOS trial was actually the trial that was first designed to satisfy the requirements of the FDA guidance. And that essentially was a full-service DCRI-run trial. We shared academic co-leadership with Oxford, but really essentially supervised the entire conduct of the study, U.S. site management, supervision, the rest of world, CEC, safety, publications ongoing, et cetera. The Excel trial, which is more towards the middle here, had a similar operational and thought leadership construct, although I think we may not have had quite the same extent of responsibility. It was very close to what we had in TICOS. And then the ongoing Harmony trial, we have thought leadership, U.S. site management. We're involved with the statistical reporting and analyses, and we also have an EHR study that's ongoing. That's a really special and exciting feature of what we're doing in that trial.
Great.
So Jennifer, obviously when we work on big trials, we have academic collaborators around the world who we've worked with, and traditionally our collaborators have been with ACS trials or coronary disease trials, but we have some new groups who we've been working with on diabetes trials, such as the DTU group. So maybe you could just briefly describe that group just so everyone can understand that we have to collaborate and we need to collaborate to do these types of trials, and what the relationship has been like with the new collaborators we've worked with on these studies.
Yeah, well, I think what we've seen over the years, though, is some evolution of, I think, what you traditionally considered your ACS co-partners into this space. I think everyone's becoming interested, so everyone's a potential partner, but this collaboration with the Oxford Diabetes Trials Unit Group was something new that was established with TICOS and then continued into the Excel program. There is a large group. They're interested in diabetes and various aspects and types of diabetes trials, and DTU is one of those. We have an upcoming study with which we'll be collaborating with a somewhat different group at Oxford, but it's been a very fruitful relationship.
Good. Okay. Well, let's start then. So again, there were those two main questions that I'll just put up again here for the audience. What did we learn, and what can we do better? And maybe Eric, let's start with your perspective on, no simple answers here, but both your personal perspective and your sense from the meeting. Like, it was kind of an experiment, right? Here, a regulatory authority kind of made these somewhat arbitrary boundaries, created the cost of billions of dollars, and it resulted in these 4 drugs so far showing some benefit and a lot of drugs showing no harm. Was it the right thing to do? And what's your sense about what should happen now? Should we abandon it or modify it? Or what's your advice to the new commissioner of the FDA?
Yeah, I guess I would start by saying a little bit of the billion number has to be put into perspective. If you think about yearly sales, for example, the drug that we studied in TICOS, their yearly sales are, into the $5 billion range. So every year they're cranking in that in terms of revenue. So the ability to spend, some proportion of money to study a drug to make sure that it's safe and effective in that setting may not be that wrong, right? I mean, if you want to take it that way. Go ahead.
Well, I was just
Gee.
sorry. I was just gonna say, but isn't that fascinating that the drug, it's our drug, right? So we're happy about it. But the drug that has no cardiovascular benefit is the one that is having billions of dollars of sales, and yet these other drugs that cost the same amount, and they're incredibly expensive, but they cost the same amount as these DPP-4 inhibitors, are just not getting used at all.
It's the Jennifer Green effect.
It's
that's-
because you were part of the trial.
It creates an opportunity.
So we'll get back to that topic because I think, maybe, I mean, we can do it now also, but I do think the question about how do we get these things better implemented
Yeah.
is a critical one that we, you can
Yeah,
either
so
address
we'll-
now or we can
we'll-
get back
We'll
to
get
it.
to that, the implementation in a second. So the first question, I didn't mean to say about which drug was being used, and I wasn't kidding about Jennifer. But the realities are that these drugs are used in a lot of people worldwide. Diabetes is only going up in terms of its frequency, and so yes, it's probably reasonable till we make sure that these drugs, and there were safety signals at the time that it came out. Whether they were confirmed or not is not clear. Had we not done large outcome studies, we would have never identified the fact that there is significant variance across the class of drugs in terms of which ones are more effective versus not. And lo and behold, we have found several that are not only showing benefit for patients with diabetes, but may open up entire new fields. These drugs may have usefulness, as was mentioned by Neha and others, in the fields of kidney disease and a way to prevent progression of renal failure, heart failure progression and creation, and then even in other fields, maybe even as a cardiovascular preventative agent. These are all the things that people are investigating now that they honestly would have never probably done had it not been for these large outcome studies. So I think the net on this is a pretty positive story. I think this should be written up as a story of where regulation actually had a positive effect for a change.
And I think that reflects the group. Don't you guys think that most people at the think tank?
Yeah.
Actually, Mary Parks, who's the FDA, the head of the metabolism group at the FDA, she described this as being, for a couple of years, she was getting a lot of heat, and very few people were supporting her. But then more recently, the conventional wisdom is this has been a good thing for the field and probably even for the pharmaceutical industry. The fact that we now have drugs which have been proven to have bigger benefits.
Can I just follow up on that? Because I mean, would we say the same thing if we just confirmed the cardiovascular safety of all these drugs? Because the reason these guidances were put in place was to confirm the safety. Yeah. And I've been on 2 FDA panels, not in diabetes, but in other fields, some more related than others, where we've gotten asked the same question. We have hundreds of patients that can confirm the efficacy. There's some safety signal, some potential cardiovascular safety signal. Should we be doing 10,000 patient cardiovascular safety studies in all drugs in obesity, for example, is a place where this has come up? Should we be, and I do think, Eric, to your point, some of it does depend on the prevalence of the disease and the major morbidities of the disease we're studying. Obviously, in common diseases where there are a lot of drugs that are going to be used for long periods of time and millions of people, it's quite feasible and maybe reasonable to say we should confirm safety. But, and it's not just a question for cardiovascular safety, right? I mean, there's which kind of cancer does a drug cause and how carefully should we adjudicate that? And you can go down the list. As cardiologists, we all think cardiovascular safety is the only important thing, but there are other, kinds of safety we should be worried about as well.
So it's a great point, isn't it? Because, and this in fact was brought up, and especially I think some of the pharmaceutical sponsors asked this question that.
Can I make one point before we get?
Can I just finish? That. Let me just finish, and then that one of the reasons that there's a pushback against this is that it's not being fair, is that we're being capricious. And why aren't hypertension drugs? Why aren't lipid drugs? There are lots of other drugs where you could say the same thing. And so I think it's an important issue.
But before we get too,
microvascular benefits,
yes.
And we're presenting this as
That wasn't my point, but I will speak to that.
we're presenting it as these trials are non-inferiority and in context useless.
Yeah.
Obviously now we've seen there are positive ones. But I think the limb to this was really around the glucose protective effects and the microvascular benefits, which
Yeah.
I thought you were going to ask about heart failure.
Right, but before we get too far down this road of trying to decide whether or not these trials have any value, I'm going to make it my personal mission to change the slide that Neha shows, because what that leaves out are the trials that actually have resulted in discontinuation of drug development because of signal of harm. So for example, miraglutazar, which was a dual PPAR agent, which was designed specifically both to lower glucose and improve various lipid parameters with the intent of reducing cardiovascular risk, actually had its development discontinued because of signs of cardiovascular harm and unexpected safety-related signals like GI hemorrhage. So that drug didn't make it to market and was an important trial to perform for the safety of our patients. And then there was another drug in an emerging class.
Aliglutazar too, yeah.
But there is a drug in a different class that more recently was taken off the market too. So that needs to be on the slide, okay, because it's lost in the conversation. But the microvascular complications, so it's almost as though these drugs that we're talking about, because they don't reduce cardiovascular risk, are worthless. So that's sort of, I think, the point Rob is trying to make, is that these drugs are approved because they lower glucose. And in fact, lowering of glucose in A1C is a pretty good surrogate for reduction in microvascular complications. I mean, that's been proven in multiple
Maybe explain what those
well-conducted
microvascular
trials.
complications are.
So retinopathy, risk of blindness, renal disease, nerve damage in the feet. So, I mean, these are non-trivial complications. They're not death, but they're things that our patients would like to avoid.
The other thing from a policy perspective, and this is interesting, you might argue that, and even the sponsors at the meeting somewhat tried to do this, but made the argument that this regulation had ultra-negative effects in that it inhibited innovation, it's usually the things, and prevents industry from investing in these drugs. But yet, you kind of have trouble to believe that, because in fact, 15 or more drugs have been tested. There are 17 or 18, maybe if you take the negatives, that have been tested and brought forward through this same pathway. That's a lot of drugs, almost many more than a lot of different fields. So in part reflects great, pipelines and other things that are out there, but it also doesn't seem to reflect that the hurdles of getting past this were high enough that they prevented companies from doing it. Nowadays, actually, what you're hearing is there are things that are preventing it, but it may be the fact that other drugs are having such success that there's concern, can I do even better than some of the results we're sort of seeing? So it's inhibition by superiority rather than necessarily by regulation.
So one thing that you brought up, Neha, was the cost of these drugs, and that the one that's being used the most has no cardiovascular benefit but costs the same as the others. So what's the average monthly cost for these new drugs? $200 a month, $300 a month?
I think it was something around you're at the VA system. I think it was something around 500.
Okay, and are they covered by most insurance plans? So
You have to get a prior auth for most of them, so it's not necessarily that strict for any of us who have tried to do it.
So what's the copayment? What's the copayment most patients who have insurance would have to pay for one of these drugs?
Yeah, I think it's about the same.
But
pretty cheap, so, I mean, reasonably in the spectrum, you
For the
can,
co-
depending on
yeah.
insurance coverage.
Yes.
But
by doing a
1575.
it's another step for the provider that takes time
Yeah.
and energy that we're all under the gun for. So
Don't you want your patients to be alive?
yes, but I'm telling you that the point
Time out of
being
my day. Sorry.
When you introduce these steps, there's the inertia part of the provider that we have to figure out how to get them over that inertia through education and so forth. But all these drugs are branded. None of them are generic yet, right?
No.
So there's going to be a copayment cost, and there's a pre-auth side, and those things influence the prescription use of the drugs. We can do a lot better than we're doing right now, but we recognize that I've seen a number of my patients refuse to take the drugs because of the copayment that they have to, assume. So there are those issues that are at play that we need to work on.
So good RX at Costco, for example, empagliflozin is $449 with the discount. So they're expensive.
But that's
Per month.
out of pocket. That's out of pocket.
Well, it's not necessarily out of pocket because that's
That's still.
That's a
So-
total cost.
total cost.
Yeah.
That's right.
Before we
Without
quite
insurance.
get there, the other question was raised earlier was, is this something we should do for other drugs? And in certain ways, so the lipid drugs don't have the requirement, and it's an example on them, but yet pretty much almost every one of those drugs has gone through a longitudinal evaluation in tens of thousands of patients. So in essence, to prove a benefit to get market penetration, most of them are going to have that data on it. Two, we focus in on cardiovascular disease and we didn't focus in on other conditions, and that's true. It does affect in part how we collect the data during the study itself. But if you study tens of thousands of patients in a trial and are looking at what happens to them, you often pick up the signals even if you're not perfectly tuned to do that. So for example, even the amputation thing was an unexpected finding. We didn't collect a lot of detailed information in the first studies on those types of things, but we were able to get a signal that there was some concern there. So even though imperfect, it's pretty darn good to follow that people, and having randomized data comparison to a standard of care is pretty good. Should we do it for other large common conditions? Well, maybe. It's interesting. I don't think people, again, initially anticipated seeing this big of a differential effect on outcome with these drugs, and quote-unquote off-target effects that we did not anticipate why there's cardiovascular benefits, from example, these empagliflozin or other of the agents. So, would we anticipate seeing differences in other fields? It has in part been required or seen in certain cases with NSAIDs as one example, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents you get. So there's been studies that have started to look at those kind of conditions. Obesity seems primed for it because of the potential both benefits or risk associated with those agents are pretty darn high. But agents that are going to be taken, that are common, that are going to be taken for a long time period, both are practical to do them and maybe are important because there usually is the money associated with long-term use.
So if I have a new diabetes drug, I'm going to design the next trial to look at the cardiovascular benefit of this drug. What's the comparator? It should be an active comparator trial now. What is the comparator? Is it empagliflozin or one of the other drugs? Jennifer, I'd ask you that question.
Well, I don't think it necessarily has to be one of the drugs with demonstrated benefit, but I think definitely at least a drug with known effects as best as we can determine them, and potentially with a neutral effect. Wouldn't be an unreasonable
But it's an active
comparator.
comparator. It's no longer
Yeah.
against placebo, right? I mean,
No longer, well, I think it depends. It's going to depend what you
Yeah.
allow
Okay.
their other care to be. So
Sure.
if you decide that you're going to enroll a patient population that now has an indication for a drug like empagliflozin to reduce cardiovascular risk, you could permit that therapy in the background. It doesn't necessarily have to be your comparator.
Used in less than 1% of patients.
Well,
Right.
Right now, but as we go forward, it'll hopefully increase. But
It'll
but
just-
it was very relevant in Excel, right? So in Excel, I think, and Rob can probably speak to this better, but in Excel, the control arm, which was placebo on the background of standard therapy, had a significantly higher rate of empagliflozin new starts than the exenatide arm, and that probably contributed. And I don't know if that study has been completed yet, but we were looking at that kind of drop-in therapy question that might have contributed to why we didn't see a difference in MACE.
I mean, and the point being is that these trials take 3 to 5 years to run and complete. And so what you start with as a comparator may actually be obsolete by the time you're finished with the study. And we have
That's
to keep that in mind. So I think it pays to be astute. And also the FDA has never been in a favor of adaptive designs. But looking forward in the future, I think that this might be an area where designing a smart trial that could reflect changes in practice during the mid-course of the trial may be something that should be considered.
Yeah.
So I guess there are a few questions there, Matt. Maybe I'll push this back to you. I mean, the question is, what's the role of the FDA in mandating? What should the comparator be? Should it, because still the guidance, like we still have to go back and say the main reason the guidance there is to assure that these drugs are not causing cardiovascular harm. So should there be the option about whether to use a active comparator with the drug proven to be safe, or should that be a requirement? So that's a regulatory question. Then the clinical question is, is there equipoise still? Can you randomize someone to not being on one of these drugs? And the answer probably right now is yes, because only 1% of people are getting them. So you probably still could now, but maybe not a couple of years from now.
I mean, if your goal is to show safety, you wouldn't want to randomize a drug that has no cardiovascular benefit against empagliflozin, because a drug that has no harm signal might look worse than empagliflozin.
So you could be strategic about it and decide which comparison was most important to you. You could have various degrees of permissiveness regarding background therapies. It would depend, I think, on the patient population enrolled. I don't think we can prevent patients with indications for particular drugs from getting them within the context of a clinical trial. I think that's kind of the bottom line.
But I think the regulatory question is a really important one, and it depends upon what type of label the company's seeking, right? So the FDA will always, defer to what the standard of care is. So, for example, when we were looking at more novel P2Y12 inhibitors, they obviously had to be compared to clopidogrel, right? Because clopidogrel was the only one that was in use, but it was a recommended therapy that was needed in the post-ACS setting. So those trials had to go against clopidogrel. Now, and if you wanted to show superiority and have that be in your label claim, you had to use what was the best, available active comparator. But the FDA generally stays out of it until it gets to the type of label that the company's hoping for. So if you have the next generation diabetes therapy and you want to show you're better than IMPA, then, and that's going to be in your label, then IMPA is going to be your active comparator. And that, so the FDA, just so everyone realizes, they don't set the rigid standards. It's more, they have a discussion with the company of what they're seeking and their labeling, and then you design the trial based upon, the positive result resulting in the label change that the company would hope to get.
The only thing that's tricky here is we've already seen in the linagliptin program that the initial CVOT was designed to be compared to sulfonylurea, and then in fact the company was required to initiate a second trial in which their drug was compared to placebo. So they're doing two.
Yeah, but it was a second trial, and they didn't actually mid-course change the first trial.
Right, but the
yeah.
original thinking was that they'd be able to use an active comparator, which I think is really going to provide a lot of valuable information, but they, again, that wasn't considered acceptable at the end of the day by the FDA.
You would hope, to this discussion, including about like lipids, like for lipids now, you have to have a trial looking at cardiovascular outcome, otherwise clinicians wouldn't use them and payers wouldn't pay. And you'd hope we'd get to that point with diabetes drugs where the marketplace and the patients and the clinicians would say, you have to do this or else you're not going to be able to sell a drug for $500 a month.
Well, the only thing that I would like to bring up as an endocrinologist is it would be wonderful if when people were diagnosed with diabetes, they could be started on one drug shown to demonstrate a cardiovascular risk reduction in addition to glucose lowering and have their diabetes controlled forever on it. But that's just not the way that it happens. And so very likely people are going to end up on combinations of many drugs. And I personally don't have a problem with someone with an indication being on a drug that reduces cardiovascular risk in addition to a drug that has demonstrated cardiovascular safety. I don't think that's unacceptable. So I think there is a role for drugs that lower glucose that don't necessarily also reduce cardiovascular risk independent of that.
Well, I think also the other concern here, and Chris, there was a slide from the meeting, I don't know if we have it, of the current diabetes guidelines, and it had multiple colors. It was like the one that had all these boxes, and it's really hard to make any sense out of what the recommended diabetes treatments are right now, especially from that slide, if you remember that. And if we don't have it, maybe we can share that with everybody.
Yeah.
But someone once said that ACS stood for acute confusional state when there were a lot of drugs being developed for the same thing. I looked at that slide as a cardiologist going, I don't know what the heck I'm going to do to treat a diabetes patient when the ADA guidelines have multiple stacked layers of 5 or 6 drugs for patients. It was just very confusing.
So it's one, we'll get back to this, but it's one of the reasons I think as cardiologists we need to be working with diabetologists to come up with pathways to better, because it is going to be complicated. It's not going to be incredibly simple. Neha, can you summarize, because there were a few things I think that we agreed on in the think tank that could be changed to be improved. And there are a lot of questions that that were raised that we need more information on. And we'll bring Rob Mentz into the discussion too. Because can you summarize what did people agree?
So not much. For those of you who haven't, this is the only one I've been to. It's basically, people are sitting around this huge U-shaped table, and it's like 50 or 60 people, and I'm at the end, and 50 or 60 people are talking, and nobody's agreeing on anything. But a few things did, but really interesting points, and a few things did get agreed upon. I will. I'm just giving people background. So one thing was that in terms of the endpoint, the composite endpoint that the FDA is kind of mandating, they mandated at least MACE. Maybe you could consider some other outcomes. I think everybody agreed that hospitalization for unstable angina is relatively useless and should not be included in the composite endpoint. And also that heart failure, hospitalization, and renal disease progression probably should be included, at least for the drugs where it makes sense, but that's something that should be seen more regularly. So that was one of the things that, probably the only thing that was truly decided upon. There was definitely a lot of discussion about what the comparator should be, and there was no decision or consensus about what the comparator should be, but there was a lot of discussion about active comparators, and maybe things should be moving that direction. And another point was this idea of when all of these trials have shown safety, do we still need the 1.8 safety margin at this point, or can we just move to 1.3 and allow marketing to happen and move to 1.3 with the promise that this, a non-inferiority trial with a 1.3 margin would happen? That there wasn't complete consensus about that, but a lot of people were kind of leaning towards that.
Can I add one?
Yeah.
The only other thing that I can say that was universally agreed upon was that randomization is key,
Yeah.
and that observational analyses and comparative effective analyses are helpful, but cannot give you an answer that you could use to change guidelines or change practice. And remember, who was it that got up and started? Was it Herzl Gerstein or someone who was like, randomization, like he was like a cheerleader, stood up, and I mean, he's right. Randomization is key, and you have to do that right type of randomized trials to answer the question, and you can't get the proper answer from an observational, non-randomized analysis.
So this slide that I just put up behind you again, illustrates, I think, that there are a lot of important outcomes, and there's really variable effects on these outcomes, both in the drugs and maybe even in some of the drugs in the same class. Like some drugs have caused increase in heart failure, and some drugs have caused a remarkable decrease in heart failure. So, and Rob, you've thought a lot about this. What about, and is it real heart failure that they're preventing, or is it just because they're getting rid of fluid, or how do we deal with this heart failure issue? And is it important?
Yes, I think the short answer is yes, it is important. I like the comment about the importance of having it as potentially within the composite or a key secondary endpoint. The landscape has changed a lot, right? So initially there was so much concern when SAVOR came out that, oh my gosh, these DPP-4s are causing all this heart failure. Then aside from alogliptin, you really do see that TICO is showing a very safe hazard ratio of 1. So I think that getting at this idea of it's not just a class effect, there are differences within the class. Heart failure is important. And it comes up now as we're taking care of patients, and for the first time over the past couple weeks, I'm prescribing empagliflozin for patients that have heart failure and diabetes. But I think the kind of key piece is that we have to have those definitive studies. So there are now large heart failure studies that are looking at empagliflozin regardless of diabetes status. So that it's called the Emperor program, and that'll be the definitive answer, right? So right now the US heart failure guidelines, they say start with metformin, and they don't really discuss these CV outcomes trials, whereas the European ones, they actually do already say it's reasonable to consider using empagliflozin, since some patients in those studies did have heart failure. But it's not well characterized, so it's a checkbox on the case report form of heart failure. We don't know as well about REF versus PEF, reduced versus preserved EF. And then I'm going to have one self-serving comment as well. So Jennifer and I are leading this diabetes cardiovascular disease symposium in April, where Chris and many others are going to be talking at. So it's April 7th at the JB Duke, and I think it's really going to extend some of the conversation you guys have already led, and hopefully will be another important piece as we think about how Duke can position ourselves in really getting out the message of how to use these drugs, implementation, and to kind of one final comment around this, I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on, you mentioned, yes, randomized data are kind of the linchpin of this, but with CVD Real and others, observational and real-world evidence, I think, have a piece in this that can be complementary. But I think as we look at these data, I think you talked nicely with Sustain and others. This is a much smaller study. These effect sizes almost seem too good to be true compared to the more adequately powered ones. So this idea of, as an institution, as we're trying to advance science in this space, we're going to be leading clinical trials, but understanding the role of real-world evidence and how we fit in that and place it in the important caveats.
Yeah, I'd say you're right, it's the spectrum, and it does have an important role. I would add, though, that you made a very important point. These drugs are now being tested in populations that don't have diabetes. And, I mean, we never, like 5 years ago, did we ever believe that would happen? I mean, that to me is the most remarkable thing. But, I mean, I think, Eric probably can speak better than anybody about the cycle of evidence and different types. But I'm amazed now that we're doing trials of diabetes therapies in patients who don't have diabetes. I mean, it's great. I love that.
Yeah, it makes the discussion about how expensive these trials are a little bit harder to swallow. If there are opportunities and new directions for these agents, it could be financially beneficial.
Yeah. Raj had a question.
So just going from the private practice standpoint, I face this problem every single day. And whose responsibility it is, If I try to kind of cross the line and say, no, you need this drug, this has been shown, when the endocrinologist with whom the person is not following or the primary care is not following. We had these issues with cardiac surgeon and cardiologist, and we have a heart team. And should we have an endo-card team now to make decisions about this thing? Because this is really the cost is one issue, and the other major issue is, am I stepping on someone's toes? And, we get really nasty phone calls. And in private practice, this is very important. In academia, if you lose a patient or 10 patients or 15 patients, it doesn't matter,
Perfect segue. Perfect segue. So Jennifer, said differently, here at Duke Hospital, we all this work has been on billions of dollars spent. We finally have something to address one of the most important causes of death and disability in the world. And Duke Hospital doesn't have them on formulary? Like, how can we fix this?
I know, and I'm arguing with individuals in my own division about the value of this information and the importance of incorporating these drugs into patients with the care of patients with established cardiovascular disease. I sort of feel like we're just starting to push the boulder up the mountain, and I think it's all of our responsibilities, and there will be pushback every day, but we just need to try to keep moving the needle.
Hey, Chris, can you send the link to this video to the chair of the P&T committee, too?
Yeah.
I think that's key.
Can you comment on what effect do all these drugs have, or what effect all these drugs have on glucose? I mean, one of the things that I've been told about these drugs is that they don't do a whole lot to glucose, and maybe also glucose in people without diabetes, because that has a big influence, I think, on people's willingness to prescribe them. I mean, one of the concerns I have about prescribing these drugs is that their endocrinologist manages all their other diabetes drugs, and I'm worried I'm going to make them hypoglycemic by putting them on something.
That is
like
a
this.
great question. So, the good thing about all of these agents is, let's say if you gave them by themselves or with a drug like metformin that doesn't cause hypoglycemia, none of them will make your blood sugar drop too low. It just doesn't happen. The mechanism of action is such that they're kind of smarter drugs. They won't drop your blood sugar too low, or they really shouldn't. Like every now and again you hear something strange. So these are drugs that are really pretty safe from a hypoglycemia perspective. However, if you have a patient who's already on insulin or a sulfonylurea and you add any drug, the risk of hypoglycemia goes up. So if that's part of their sort of care equation already, you have to be very cognizant of that, and you will need to talk with whoever is managing their diabetes, unfortunately, to decide if it's okay to do that. But these are all pretty potent glucose-lowering agents, especially semaglutide really brings blood sugar down a lot. And it's not really clear if the cardiovascular benefit is necessarily related to that. It could be a piece of it. But as far as glucose control overall, they're really very, very effective.
So I think this raises a good point. As providers, the thing that drives our behavior, and we've shown this over and over again, the first thing that drives it is do no harm or non-maleficence, right? That we're more worried about giving a drug that can cause harm, and hypoglycemia is the harm that we're worried about. We're not so worried about hyperglycemia because these patients are unlikely to go into DKA, unless something crazy happens. But we're more worried about the hypo episode that could lead to death. And so, I think that's the mentality that we have to overcome. Most drugs that are new, that's the thing that's do no harm, is that people are worried about prescribing the drug and causing bleeding for a new antithrombotic or causing hypoglycemia. That limits our use. And so we really need to think in our implementation studies about the physician mindset of when and why to start, as well as how to interact with the other specialties
to overcome some of these barriers. And I think that's a really key point, that subtly that we don't even think about influences all of our behaviors.
Yeah.
Chris, how should we overcome these barriers?
So we have a couple of minutes left, and you're not allowed to. I'm the moderator. I'm the moderator. So let me just say, and I'm going to give you the last word, Eric, because I'm going to ask you. But I hope this has been interesting for people. I think one of the things that the think tank in today's session has highlighted is there's a huge amount of opportunity to better understand and do more research in this area, including around heart failure, renal progression, understanding combinations of these drugs, but probably nothing more important than how do we get things implemented more effectively and make sure that patients actually are achieving the benefits, not just of these treatments, but of ways to prevent cardiovascular outcome related to diabetes. And we've got a lot of talent here on the panel addressing that. But Eric, can you summarize what do you think the DCI should be doing?
Well, I think it's doing it actually. If you want to take it to the extreme, a few weeks ago or last week it was, when you did the talk on atrial fibrillation, and we summarized the incredible circles of data from very early studies that we were doing to all the different therapies and how we tested out and proved they're safe and effective to ultimately now the implementation work, has gone a long way to changing how and what we do with atrial fibrillation and preventing strokes across this country. We should be very proud. With diabetes, it may even be broader because we went back to actually the formative stages of the regulation that created this field we were part of and helped drive. Now we carried out some of the earliest studies and continue to carry out the large studies that show the benefits of these agents or not. And now we're just at the beginning of this sort of that final and very important step of how do we get these drugs more commonly used and look at all the issues that we have in other fields, but take the lessons learned from those other fields and now apply them to diabetes.
Final questions or comments?
I'll say that one thing is we do have a white paper that will be coming out, as we do after each one, and Neha has promised to have it submitted within 4 months of the finish of the think tank, and the white paper is an enduring material from every think tank that we're hopefully everybody will get a chance to see. I'm sorry to interject because I know Marty had a comment, but yeah. I hope you're already working on writing that.
Yes.
So maybe this is a question for Dr. Green and others. What I hear back from sponsors is the challenge they have is not as much the specialist as it is primary care. Who is using the combo therapies, and is it endocrinologists and cardiologists they should be focused on? Does it start there, or does it include primary care?
Well, one part that we haven't mentioned, but that is really important to implementation, is getting this information into the guidelines in a simplified and user-friendly way, and in a way that is palatable to primary care, because that is the setting in which the vast majority of diabetes care occurs. And so, yes, I mean, I think that needs to be a key component of whatever we end up doing.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you all for participation in our great panel, and have a good day. Yep.
Nice job.
That was fun. Yeah, it was great.